Angelo Smear. Welcome back to another episode of the Lovable Survivor podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the number one question I get every single day when I talk to other survivors. This is the most common question when you look on the internet. It is the most researched. It is clearly the question everybody asks when they get started on a recovery journey, myself included. I remember being at the hospital asking this question, and I will tell you, it is not the answer you want to. The question I get, the number one question on the board, without question, without fail, when it comes to stroke and brain injury recovery is, how long does the recovery process take? And the answer, much like I bet if I asked you to put money on it, probably would guess, is the recovery process question. The answer is, it depends. However, nobody ever actually explains to you as a stroke survivor, as a brain injury survivor, what does that actually mean? The reason it depends, I will tell you in my take, definitely depends because, again, this is very annoying. People say this all the time. It's very dependent on the situation. And get into a lot of things on this episode. But before I do that, I want to just mention one more thing. If you are interested in becoming a part of the Survivor Science community, please head over to vip.survivorscience.com. It is the community I am in the process of building. And if you are a listener of this podcast, if you are a fan or interested in, finding more resources, maybe you're tired of forums online, maybe you're just tired of this podcast, I think it's going to be a great resource for fellow survivors of really major medical life event. I am particular to the brain injury survivor, group, just because stroke is a brain injury. Actually, stroke is the second leading cause of both death and disability worldwide, which is something I honestly did not know until recently. Doing research for this podcast, I've been so focused on my own journey and talking to others and sort of beginning that process of building out a community that I never realized how broad globally stroke is when it comes to both death and disability. So that was surprising to me. Anyways, vip.survivorscience.com. That way you can kind of stay in the know and in the loop. And if you are interested in joining when we launch, definitely sign up there because that is how you will find out other than this podcast. So again, in today's episode, we're going to talk about the big question on the board, which is how long does recovery take? And the answer, like I said, it depends. However, I'm going to kind of tell it from my perspective and why it depends. And, I think it's easy to ignore the medical professionals sometimes because we get so entwined with our own story, our own specific outlook that, that sort of timing definitely is it's a question and a concern, I think, for any survivor. Well, I will tell you, it is a long process. And if it is anything short of a long process, you are very lucky. So I'm going to look at it, because I'm going into my fourth year of being a survivor now, that I'm going to go through kind of the expectations and shortcomings that I had in year 1, year 2, year 3, just to kind of give you a broad sense of how long it can take. And before we jump in, I will remind you that it is like I said, it's a long, arduous process. And honestly, this episode's a little late being recorded because last week I had a little hiccup unexpectedly. That caught me off guard last week. And now my kids are on spring break, so things are busy, things are happening around the house. You might even hear some background noise today, unfortunately. But yeah, I think along the way, you learn how to deal with adversity. You pick up skills. You learn how to deal with hurdles and hiccups or whatever you want to call them. All useful skills, but it definitely doesn't make things easier along the way. So kind of the things I want to touch on in today's episode for why people say it depends is because it genuinely depends. I think it depends because you may have pre-existing health conditions that you either are aware of or weren't aware of prior to a stroke or brain injury that will kind of set the table. So I had a lot of things wrong with me that I was unaware of prior to my stroke. My medical chart down here in Florida is a very long chart. There are many things wrong. I had undiagnosed COPD. That's just one thing. I had my stroke in December of 2019. 2 months later, I got diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So that was a double whammy. So of course, my journey is going to be unique because I don't even think I've met another stroke survivor that has MS. Yeah. So again, I do want to remind everybody prior to my stroke, I was sort of a closeted functional alcoholic. I'm not saying that to brag. That's not meant to be anything other than just kind of let you know that I, a former cigarette smoker. None of those things are helpful. Certainly played a part in the stroke, certainly played a part in the MS. I was overweight. So I was unraveling quite a few things in the beginning, and I'm still kind of unraveling. I think my journey might be different because, you take stroke and you take just those handful of things I just mentioned, and you start the long journey to recovery. It's going to take some patience, perseverance. It's going to take support. It's going to take a lot of things. It's going to take, reassessing my life, where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do. So I think those are just some early indicators that can have a significant impact both on your recovery and how long it's going to take. There were some other factors, because smoking and drinking obviously is not ideal, that had led to some heart-related issues. My stroke was not a brain hemorrhage. It was ischemic stroke. So, my heart was not pumping enough. That's why the blood got cut off the brain. Undiagnosed sleep apnea, lots of things. So again, it's quite a process. You may not have as long as a list of things as I had. I hope you don't, because I can tell you it's really long. It's worthwhile, but it is long and it is still going. And my recovery continues. So I think the first few days and weeks and the first year really is about getting stable. Now, for me, stable means I'm listening to doctors. I was taking medications. I was making significant changes in my life. Not like some were drastic, some were just immediately necessary, like no more drinking, no more smoking. Those things are cut out of my life. Which I'm eternally grateful for in a sense. I don't think anybody wants to have a stroke to stop being a drinker or a smoker. Now I'm looking back in the rear view 3+ years and I'm grateful for it. I got lucky kind of in the sense that I don't struggle with no longer drinking or smoking. I have no interest in either of those activities. So I don't have to go to AA. I could. I don't know if I'm fully out of the weed, but I have no desire to drink or smoke. So in that sense, stroke really saved my life. Yeah, but that first year is incredibly difficult We've talked about it a number of times in this podcast. There's that initial wave of what's happened when it comes to dealing with some deficits. It took a long time, almost about a year, to start walking confidently, at a year and a half to start driving. These are things that can happen quicker for some people. Maybe you don't have as many health issues. I was trying to resolve a bunch of things while not only dealing with stroke and going back to work and raising a family. I had a daughter going to college. My daughter graduated high school in 2021. So she was going into her senior year. There was COVID. It was a lot of things. People have talked about COVID ad nauseum, gratefully so. That has been a difficult thing for the entire world. In my case, it was just another thing piled on to the stroke. That first year is about getting stable. I was taking medications. I'm still taking medications. In fact, I forgot a medication last week, which is why I almost had a little bit of an episode. So there are things that happen along the way. Even when you're doing things like running and actively working on yourself and trying to get healthy and eat right, there still might be a snag you weren't expecting along the way. So that is something I didn't think I'd have to worry about, but it was a good reminder that you need to be cognizant of what's going on around you. Yeah. I mean, it sounds silly that I would forget I refilled the prescription last week. I got the prescription and then I just forgot to put some of the pills in my pill box, which generally isn't an issue. But when you're 6'8" and 325 pounds still, you go running in the heat, you might want to make sure you're both hydrated and you're taking all your medications still. I can come off a lot, probably. And I've spoken to doctors about coming off a few, but there's still a few that remain that need to be part of the equation for me. And like I said, we're going into year 3. So it is an ongoing process and it is not going to happen overnight. I think that is one of the big things I will say about year 1 that I kind of regret is that you go through this major thing like a stroke or a brain injury of any kind, and you're left with some deficit typically. And medication is great for getting stable, getting healthy, getting you on your way because you're going, doctors told me like, oh, you should start walking. Motherfucker, I'm still in a wheelchair. How am I going to start walking? But there's a lot of things you can do, that some people forget and you don't even realize later when you're like, oh, I could have been doing that the whole time. So that is a thing. There's always something you could be doing. May not feel like the most productive thing, but you'd be surprised. So I think going back to year 1, like I said, it's about getting stable, about getting healthy. It's about changing habits. There are obviously the bigger deficits, like walking is a big thing for most people. That's where you might see the most progress is like bigger sort of deficits that you've been left with. I was able to start walking, and depending on where the stroke happens, if you have a stroke or any brain injury, is what part of the brain is affected. In my case, it was motor skills, so that is going to be the hardest thing for me. And that continues to be true. Something I'm working on because we're getting closer. But again, there's no magic pill. And I think for me, that's one of the big things that I think I latched onto it because when you're going through this process, you're kind of like hoping for sort of these miracles because they do talk about them. They could happen. I don't think they happen as often as people talk about them. If they do happen, take your lucky stars. But there is no magic pill. There is not to date any pill that will erase the effects of stroke. So it's going to be a lot of hard work. It's going to feel tireless and endless. And sometimes, often, it's not linear. So, if an X amount of hours, it's not the same as a broken bone. This is not going to be a 4 to 6 week. I mean, it could be, but it's likely not going. So it's not going to be linear. These are things that people mean to say, but they forget to say. So it's not linear. It's going to take some time. There is no magic pill. Another thing is age plays a factor, but I will tell you, as somebody in the hospital who repeatedly said this, and I was told very often, oh, you're young, you'll bounce back. Hey, great. When is that bounce back going to happen? I remember specifically being in my room at Brooks here in Jacksonville, Florida, watching people that had a stroke, not too far off or even more recently than I did. And there would be like a 75-year-old patient doing laps around the hallway without any assistance. They were basically walking totally fine. They might have had some monitors clipped on, but they were walking. They maybe weren't walking a marathon. They weren't walking 5 miles an hour speed, but they were walking. And I was sitting there in my wheelchair, half their age, wondering, when the hell is this bounce back supposed to happen? So there are some things that got into my head where I was hoping for these miracle pills or just sort of any of these stories that I'd heard. I was waiting so badly for it to happen. The reality is it may never happen. And so I think the sooner you wrap your head around that, just sort of prioritize in year one. Like I said, there's a lot of overwhelm. So it's really about assessing, whether you're able to do it yourself or with somebody else's help. Just kind of make notes and make your own list of here's what's kind of my situation, and here's where I want to make improvements, and list them out. And then kind of try to come up with a plan for how you make a little bit of progress each day. I know that's hard to hear in the beginning because you're like, wait, I was fine 2 weeks ago. How am I not fine 2 weeks later? That is something to deal with. That is one of the other hard parts. I remember walking into the hospital December 21st, not really in good shape, but I walked into there and under my own power, was admitted to the hospital. 2 days later, I have a stroke on December 23rd, 2019, and everything changes. Unfortunately, when everything changes like that and you have a stroke, everything doesn't go back to place the way it did as you walked in there. Okay, so year one is a big one. I'm going to try to kind of move along the next couple of years. Like I said, year one, you want to assess things. Mental standpoint, take stock of what has changed, where you're hopeful to make progress. And that list really, if you're familiar with project management or Kanban, it's really just something you're constantly evaluating. Is this where you want to make progress this week, this month? I will say, when you have a stroke, I was never great with goals. I have gotten better with goals because the stroke sort of forced my hand to organize, ask for help, and constantly reevaluate, reassess my own things. I was always very good with that with other people, but not so much myself. So, keep on top of that and keep asking yourself, where can I improve? Where do I want to improve? When there are places you want to improve and you feel like it's time, you might consider starting to do some research. Google is very helpful. There are lots of things online, lots of YouTubers. If you're still in therapies, physical therapy, occupational therapy, work with a therapist, reassess. I think that's another big one. Year one, you're going to see the biggest probably changes, but you're going to hear a lot of other things too. You only have 4 months, you only have 6 months. You have time. I'm going into year 3 and I'm still making progress. That may not be the same for somebody who is 65 and has a stroke, but I don't want you to get caught up in what other people say, even myself. Like, just assess your situation, assess where you're at and where you want to kind of keep progressing. It is going to be a little slower as it gets longer, but you're kind of 2021 was your going into year one, or well, I guess year two. Yeah, but 2021, I reassessed my goals, where I was going. I made progress in year two. Started driving, felt comfortable, got back to the gym. And I was able to make continued progress. I go back to rehab almost every year. I did not go last year. I am back this year. I didn't go last year because last year was year two, and I wanted to kind of see where I could take it on my own. So I got into Peloton. I got into running. I will remind everybody that I'm 6'8", 325 pounds. I am not considered a runner by any definition. I don't look like a runner. I don't wear runner clothing. I wear hoodies when I go running. It's time. I am bigger than most left tackles in the NFL. And if you're not aware, left tackle is one of the biggest football players on the field. So the fact that I am a bigger human being than the majority of NFL football players should give you that's really just to let you know perspective. Where my perspective is coming from, how strange it might seem that I'm a runner now. Offensive linemen are not known for their running abilities. They are not running back. They're not a wide receiver. They're not even a tight end. They are big dudes that move other big dudes. So I'm very much on brand. I am non-traditional in the best sense possible. So again, last year I made pretty good progress on my own. I wanted to give myself some time to figure out different things. I took a vacation with my family last year, got into Peloton. Like I said, started getting into running later in the year, reassess business stuff. That's my motto, is kind of like I keep trying to figure out how to get better. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't go to therapy every year. It's just like, I just didn't last year. I just wanted to see where I could go and how I can progress. And I feel pretty good about the fact that I got into Pelotoning after brushing that off as an activity for years. Then, like I said, just continuing to do the work, continuing to do research, seeing how I could help both myself and other people. That's what's got me into building a community now, is that I feel like I'm on the way to being even more helpful to other people, but able to continue to work myself. Yeah. And so, but I was not satisfied with where I got last year. So this year I'm back in physical therapy. My team is back. I think part of the reason I did not go back to physical therapy last year was because my physical therapist that I worked with tirelessly since getting there in 2020, she was on maternity leave she had a baby girl. And so now that she's back, I'm back. We're figuring out how I can get better with running, still 3 years in, doing some strengthening on the lower legs. That could be because it's a little bit on my fault, but I had some medical issues that were lingering for a while that have since been resolved. But I think that was part of the reason strengthening of my calves in particular was slow. So again, I will remind you, year one, you're going to probably see the biggest sort of significant changes, but it's going to continue if you continue to put in the work. Now, it won't be a straight line. It won't be maybe as obvious or as clear as you would like it to be. people talk about 1,000 hour, 2,000 hour, 10,000 hours, like that not a thing, but I'm not saying don't keep your expectations low. I guess I'm saying keep your expectations low because the work you put in doesn't necessarily correlate. I mean, eventually it will work out, but it may not be as quickly happen as it might have happened before, or you might expect, I think is the big takeaway there. So, again, everybody will tell you it takes time. It is so true. It is never what I wanted to hear. Because stroke is a really severe medical brain issue that is going to have long-term effects, and you're really trying to reverse kind of long-term effects. So again, these things can happen sort of overnight or kind of magically. It just don't get caught up in the belief that it'll perfectly work out for you, or that if the amount of time just might be significantly longer than you think. You hear that all the time in business and in life, and probably if you've done any project of any kind throughout your career. You've heard plan X amount of more time. And I think that is true here, but it is like, it's just more here. This is not a better way to say it, I don't think. I'm just trying to set realistic expectations, because sometimes, when people are trying to be helpful and stay positive, which is something that has changed in my life because I was not always positive Polly. Now people always say, "Oh, you have such a great outlook." I think I've just gotten to a point where I have a realistic expectation. Great if things happen sooner or faster than I think they are going to happen, but that's not always the case. And the work that you put in doesn't always have an immediate impact. Like I said, 10,000 hours. I don't know if that's true or not. In most cases, it typically is, but it's a long time to get 10,000 hours too on top of that. So yeah, I think the timetable is different for everybody. I think age definitely plays a factor. I think pre-existing conditions definitely play a factor. And, it is like I've said this over and over and over. It's a long process, because a brain injury is not really the same thing as, I'm not trying to say all broken bones are the same, but generally speaking, there is a clear path with that. With brain injury, it's very, very different. So I think as long as you keep your expectations you constantly reassess. I think that is the best thing to do. Have some long-term goals. Like if you're unable to walk and you want to walk, make that a big goal. I think things like that, For me, I didn't focus on handwriting early on. I think there are lots of things that I could do differently. And with time and effort and work, those things change. But you do have to kind of assess, because it's hard to do everything at once. I've said this before. I said this early in the podcast that, you walk into the hospital, or maybe you don't, but chances are if you survive a stroke, you kind of remember the way things were. Logically, in your head, in my head, I thought everything would go back to the way it was, but that's not the way it works, unfortunately. Again, age plays a huge factor. Pre-existing conditions plays another factor. It stands to reason that if you're 37, you should, theoretically, be up and running pretty quickly, but you could also be 65 and up and running pretty quickly. It's just a real strange thing that you may not even realize if you're listening to this and you're in the podcast and you're in a hospital. I say this a lot because my kids were my youngest was very young when I had my stroke. I kind of equate my stroke to, I was 37, I had all my motor functions, and I quickly was cut down at the time, my youngest was 4, and I was brought quickly to reality. I noticed my son and I have similar motor skills, and that has been true since my stroke. My stroke happened at 37. He was 4. So he's now 7, and our motor skills are pretty much on par when it comes to handwriting and typing, which is, mildly funny, but super annoying. It's kind of like we were playing Candyland over the weekend. I was like, that's what a stroke is like. Like when you get to the top of Candyland and then you got to go back to the bottom of Candyland and you got to start over. And yeah, some things happen sooner and faster, but some things also take a real long time to get back. And frankly, you may never get it back. No matter how hard you try, that's another difficult thing to overcome. So I think when it comes to how long does it take, absolutely, unequivocally, annoying as all hell, people, myself included, will say it depends. However, I don't want to dissuade anybody, and I won't sugarcoat it, because I promise I wouldn't do that on this podcast. Definitely depends. I recommend keeping realistic expectations. I recommend reassessing constantly, whether that's weekly, monthly, quarterly, yearly, whatever, all of the above. Don't let other people get in your head, whether it's positive or negative. I think, take all the information, absorb what you can, learn from others. There are plenty of good books. There are not as many podcasts. There's lots of good resources available on YouTube, online, from your own teams. I'm sure there are great therapists, physical therapists, regular therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, all across the country and the world. Take advantage of any and all resources that you can. But again, it's going to take time. Every human being is different. Every brain is different. Every brain injury is different. Just, there is no simple answer to how long does it take. It could take you could be lucky. There are people I've seen that seem pretty good on the outside 3 months after they've had a stroke. Like, you had a stroke? I know that's not a great thing to say to another stroke survivor, and I'm still mesmerized by how fast they seem to have things together, but they might have more hidden, issues than you think. So just because somebody looks like they have it together, don't think they have it all together. Again, I will remind you, please, 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 because I learned this lesson last week. Always check your medications. Always check with your doctors. I got into the habit of just shoveling my pills in my mouth every day. A lot of them I'm on the way to getting off of, but some of them I may need for a couple more years, and that's totally fine. I'm fine with that. Remember, check medications, stay on top of stuff, stay on top of your own health. And, don't take second chance for granted. It is not easy, but it is worthwhile. And, I think that's really all I had to say on this episode. Again, the answer is really complex. It is super nuanced. These are the things that people don't actually tell you, is that it's just very nuanced and there are lots of factors that go into it. So when people say it depends, I hope you've gotten a little bit more of an introduction to why it depends, because that answer on its own is really not enough for anybody. It's not helpful. It is not, kind of leaves you in the same spot you're in, which is something I'm very much against. Try to leave better than you found it kind of thing. Same thing with this answer is now I hope you know why it depends a little bit more. I don't think I fully answered it in this 40-minute episode, but I feel like we're on the way. And again, I think, we'll leave it there. And please, if you found this podcast or any other episodes in back history of this podcast, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating or review, big on Good Pods now, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you feel like leaving a review. If you found this helpful, if you'd like to hear more, I'd love to hear from you. Please check out the show notes. Again, podcast.lovablesurvivor.com. And again, your ratings are really